In 1529, the Ottoman Empire marched into the heart of Europe. At the head of the army stood one of the most powerful rulers in history, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. His eyes were fixed on the gateway to Europe. The target, Vienna. Had this city fallen, European history might have been rewritten forever. But it didn't. So why did the Ottomans fail to take Vienna? And perhaps, more importantly, even if they had succeeded, would history truly have changed? It all began in 1526. At the Battle of Mohács, the Ottoman army delivered a crushing defeat to the Kingdom of Hungary. Although the Hungarian throne was left vacant, the Ottomans supported John Zapolya, while the Habsburgs backed Ferdinand. This brought two great powers into direct conflict, and at the center of this struggle stood the gateway to Europe, Vienna. This war brought two absolute powers face to face. At the head of the campaign stood the Sultan himself, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the longest reigning ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and the architect of its golden age. Just 3 years after Mohács, he once again led his army deep into the heart of Europe. On the opposing side stood the rising power of the Habsburgs, Ferdinand. But this so-called rising power was not nearly as prepared as it appeared. When news arrived that the Ottomans were marching on Vienna with an army of 120,000 men, Ferdinand abandoned the city. The defense was left in the hands of the experienced 70-year-old commander, Count Nicholas von Salm. Despite his age, von Salm organized the city, strengthened its defenses, and kept the spirit of the soldiers alive. This war was not merely a siege. It was the collision of two worlds. The Ottoman army held a clear numerical advantage. Historical estimates suggest that around 100,000 to 120,000 soldiers took part in the campaign. The force included elite janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, fast-moving Akıncı raiders, and a powerful artillery corps. By contrast, Vienna's defenders numbered only around 20,000 to 25,000 men. But this battle was never just about numbers. The Ottoman army was exceptionally powerful in open-field warfare. But Vienna was protected by thick, fortified walls. The defenders, though fewer in number, held a much stronger position, and Count von Salm had certainly not remained idle. He had ordered secondary defensive lines to be built, reinforced the banks of the Danube, evacuated the civilians from within the city, and stockpiled enough provisions to last for months. He even went as far as having the city's cobblestone streets torn up, to reduce the impact of incoming cannon fire. That is why, in this battle, the decisive factor was never simply strength, but the conditions themselves. The Ottoman army set out from Istanbul on May 10th, 1529. But this was no ordinary campaign. It was a grueling march of nearly 1,500 kilometers. Heavy rains began along the way. The roads turned into mud. The heavy cannons, so critical for the siege, were either left behind or could not be used effectively. By the time the army reached Vienna, it was already exhausted and worn down. The siege began. The walls were bombarded, tunnels were dug, and repeated assaults were launched. For days, Ottoman artillery kept the city under intense fire. At one point, an Ottoman cannonball severely wounded the fortress commander, Count von Salm. But the city did not fall. Days passed, time was running out, and conditions were turning against the Ottomans. Intelligence reports from the surrounding region indicated that a large German army was gathering in Linz, approximately 150 kilometers from Vienna. This development completely changed the course of the siege. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, unwilling to take an even greater risk, ordered the army to lift the siege. In truth, there was no single reason behind the Ottoman failure at Vienna. This was the result of multiple problems coming together. Heavy rain slowed the army's advance. The roads turned into mud, making logistics far more difficult. Moreover, although the army had left Istanbul in May, it was only ready for siege operations by September 27th. This meant a serious loss of time. The lack of sufficient heavy artillery prevented the walls from being breached quickly. The long distance between Istanbul and Vienna placed enormous strain on supply lines. The delay in the expected artillery ammunition prevented the siege from being carried out with the desired intensity. The season had advanced, winter was approaching, and Vienna resisted far longer than expected. The Ottoman command had planned to capture the city through a short siege, but things did not go according to plan. To make matters worse, intelligence reports from the surrounding region showed that a large German army was gathering in Linz, approximately 150 kilometers from Vienna. This created the risk of the Ottoman army being trapped between two fronts, in other words, being exposed to crossfire. And this risk was far too great to ignore. With all of these factors combined, the Ottoman army was forced to withdraw. So what if the Ottomans had taken Vienna? This would not simply have been the fall of a city. The balance of power in Europe could have been rewritten. Vienna was also an economic center. It stood at the crossroads of major trade routes. Its capture by the Ottomans could have opened entirely new economic opportunities. But managing that wealth would have been far more difficult than winning it. Had the city come under Ottoman rule, it would likely have undergone both cultural and administrative transformation. But this transformation would not have been one-sided. The Ottoman Empire, too, would have been influenced by the city itself. Europe, meanwhile, would certainly have reacted. Either a grand alliance would have formed, or some states might have chosen to negotiate with the Ottomans. But the real question is this: would this victory have triggered new wars or brought about a long period of peace? But perhaps the real issue was not this at all. It was never simply about whether Vienna fell. The real question was whether the Ottoman Empire could sustain such immense power. The age of Suleiman was a peak, but behind that peak, critical fractures were already beginning to emerge, especially the issue of Prince Mustafa. This was not merely a palace affair. It was a turning point that would shape the future of the state itself. According to some views, had strong and capable leadership continued, the fate of the empire might have been different. But once the chain of leadership was broken, even great victories could lose their meaning. Because the issue was never simply winning. It was about sustaining that power, and the world itself was changing. Europe was advancing, technology was progressing, state structures were evolving. Any power unable to adapt to this transformation was ultimately destined to fall behind. That is why the fall of Vienna might have been a victory in the short term, but in the long term, the real determining factor would have been who controlled that victory. History shows us one thing: Building an empire is difficult, but keeping it alive is far more difficult. In the period following Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire was still a great power. Yet the real question was never its size, but how that power would be managed. Under the reign of Selim II, the issue was no longer about new victories to be won, but about how to preserve the power already in hand. And perhaps that was the true problem, not possessing such immense power, but being able to sustain it in the right way. That is why, according to some views, the fact that Vienna did not fall was not merely a loss, but also a sign of the limits the Ottoman Empire could realistically carry. And perhaps sometimes, the greatest victories left unachieved can prevent even greater consequences in the long run. So what do you think would have happened if the Ottomans had taken Vienna and strong leadership had continued afterward? Would history truly have been written differently? Or would internal dynamics have led everything back to the very same outcome?